This episode of the Unresolved podcast is brought to you by Harry's Razors. Harry's is a company founded by two guys, Jeff and Andy, who were fed up with the high prices of cheaply made razors. They started their own company to provide a great shave at a fair price, and they are so confident in their razor quality that they'll provide a trial shave set for free when you sign up at harrys.com/unresolved. This free trial set includes a weighted ergonomic razor handle, 5 precision-engineered blades with a lubricating strip and trimmer blade, rich lathering shave gel, and a travel blade cover. All of that, which is a $13 value, you can get for free by simply heading to harrys.com/unresolved and paying a few bucks for shipping. For those of you looking to get your holiday shopping done early, Harry's just released their special edition holiday sets that would make a great gift. I'm normally not one to promote items that I wouldn't personally use, but Harry's razors really do live up to their reputation. I've actually been a fan of theirs for a while now, after heading to my local store and finding Harry's razors to be more than $5 cheaper than the competitors. Once again, you can head to harrys.com/unresolved to take advantage of this great offer and see what Harry's has to offer. That's harrys.com/unresolved. This episode of the Unresolved podcast is also brought to you by Studio Sweden. Studio Sweden is a headphones manufacturer that works hard to provide high-quality Bluetooth headphones that don't lose the quality of whatever you're listening to, whether that be your favorite musical artist, or even the new episode of Unresolved. If you head to studiosweden.com, you can use the offer code UNRESOLVED15 to save 15% off any pair of headphones. Head to studiosweden.com, that's SUDIOSWEDEN.com, to find your favorite pair of headphones today. From 1982 to 1985, 3 men haunted the nation of Belgium. Police and the media differed on theories regarding the men and their motives, but agreed unanimously that these were no ordinary criminals. These 3 men, who usually acted together and displayed military tactics used by the state police, showed no mercy. They were not afraid to shoot at anyone that got between them and their mission. This included parents, children, and in some cases, both. The Gang of Nivelles, as they had first been called by the press, used Volkswagen and Audi vehicles as their getaway cars. These were usually stolen from various spots in the Brussels area. After the crimes, these vehicles would be found in remote wooded areas, having been covered in gasoline and set on fire. Police would struggle to get any evidence from the vehicles, most of them having been stripped ahead of time. This implied a mechanical expertise of some sort, especially since some of the vehicles had been modified. Delhaize grocery stores were the main target of this roaming band of criminals. The men would choose one of these supermarkets nearby a major highway. Then, armed with semi-automatic rifles and other weapons, they would rob the store, commit heinous acts of violence, and make their escape before law enforcement had the chance to even respond. Oftentimes, these assaults would take a handful of innocent lives, but take just a few minutes to pull off. The timing of the attacks led investigators to believe that the bandits had advanced knowledge of police actions. After disappearing for the entirety of 1984, the Brabant Killers, as they were now known, resurfaced in 1985 for 3 separate attacks. These attacks were the bloodiest yet, taking over a dozen lives combined. The overall haul for the crimes was minuscule compared to the human cost, making many believe that the crimes were more terror-based than anything else. After all, a single bank robbery would have taken less time and yielded a higher score than these various dozens of supermarket robberies. After their final assault in November of 1985, the Brabant Killers seemed to just disappear forever. In this episode, I will explore how the investigation proceeded over the next few decades, and the many theories and suspects that have cropped up in the years since. Welcome to the Unresolved podcast. I'm your host, Michael Whelan, and this episode is the fourth in my series based on the infamous Brabant Killers. This episode, which takes place after the crime spree of the mysterious gang, puts us in the home stretch of the story, speculating more on the suspects, theories, and drama surrounding the investigation. If you would like to support the podcast, you can do so by rating and reviewing it positively on iTunes. However, if you would like to go even further than that and help me make the podcast a regular weekly show, then you could head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to become a patron. I've started posting some new content over there, and you could get access to a bunch of cool perks like some merchandise, behind-the-scenes content, commercial-free episodes, etc. If you would like to stay in touch, you could head to the podcast website, which is unresolved.me, to learn more. Now, without any further ado, we head back in time to over 30 years ago, when the Brabant Killers, also known as the Bende van Nieuwel, just finished the most heinous crime spree in Belgian history. Following the last attack by the Brabant Killers in November of 1985, police were desperate to discover any clue that could lead to the men's identities. The public was still living in the fallout of the attack, and they were glued to the news, which had focused on the deaths of 8 men, women, and children, along with the 7 wounded survivors. The fear was palpable. Regardless of their motives, the Brabant Killers had made going to the grocery store a fear-inducing outing. If their motive had been robbery, which many doubted, then they had become accidental terrorists. After the last incident, a couple of witnesses had spotted some points of interest for the police to explore. One witness had seen what looked like the body of a criminal, most likely the towering giant, laying beside the gang's getaway car. This car was later found in those same woods, doused in gasoline and set ablaze. Investigators began to theorize that the giant, who had acted as the group's leader in many of their robberies, had been fatally wounded by a police officer during their escape from the Delhaize supermarket. Many years later, forensics teams would confirm that the area in which the witness had seen the body had seen some gunfire, implying that the merciless killers had put one of their own out of their misery. But this would actually confirm nothing, so it's pure speculation at this point. Another witness account would state that at least 2 men from 2 different vehicles, the Volkswagen Golf, which was later found burned in the woods, and an unidentified Mercedes, met up at a pier on a nearby river. These 2 men were throwing what looked like guns and ammunition into the water, both of which would be recovered about a year later, in November of 1986. To many, this was just confirmation that the men who had acted as the Brabant Killers had disbanded following their final robbery. It was possible that one of their own, most likely the giant, had been killed, and they were now calling it quits in his wake. However, the investigation had to move forward as if another attack was imminent. After all, the public was not satisfied with allegations and theories. It had been over 3 years since the Brabant Killers had surfaced, and in that time they had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, killed at least 28 people, and wounded 40 others. Sadly, at this point in 1985, the Brabant Killers were just becoming the tip of the iceberg. In 1983, law enforcement had dabbled with the idea that another group of criminals, called the Berains, had also been the Brabant Killers. As far as I could tell, the Berains were primarily thieves. They mostly stole things, such as cars, but they had been rumored to have been involved in violent robberies. And since they had some semblance of a criminal operation, police quickly moved in on them as the Brabant Killers. But while police were holding them in captivity, including their leader, a former police officer named Michel, for a time period of many months, the Brabant Killers continued to strike. This all but confirmed that the Berains were not involved in the crimes, but that did not stop police from holding them for a good period of time. The men known as the Berains were held in police custody for about 2 years, a long enough period for the Brabant Killers to strike multiple times and establish the Berains' innocence in those crimes. And, other than that, police had been sitting on forensics testing, which showed that the guns belonging to the Berains had no correlation to the Brabant shootings. But other than this, the pool of suspects was fairly shallow at this time. So instead, law enforcement began to focus on an emerging threat to Belgium at that time, which took the form of terrorist organizations. Over the past 3 episodes, I've spoken briefly about right-wing extremist organizations that were active during this time period. The Westland New Post was a far-right extremist organization with neo-Nazi sympathies, founded in 1981. The WNP rose from the ashes of another organization, which I won't even try pronouncing, but which was disbanded in the early 1980s after many of its members were convicted for forming a private armed militia. The goals of this group were pretty simple: to sow racial and societal discord, and it was based in the Brussels area, where the Dutch and French cultures were experiencing a lot of tension. At the time, there was a lot of animosity towards French-speaking Belgians, and the fear among the old guard, as it were, was that this French culture would continue to spread throughout Belgium, eliminating what traditions were already in place. The WNP, headed by its leaders, Paul Latinus and Michel Libert, hoped to capitalize on this strife. They began doing what they could to inspire chaos in the area, going as far as placing agents inside law enforcement and local politics. By the time state police had infiltrated the WNP, the Westland New Post had already managed to infiltrate the municipal and national government, with aims meant to inspire right-wing reform. The group's leader, Paul Latinus, was found dead in the early days of 1984, with what looked to be a suicide. However, his death has long inspired controversy, as the facts of his death never seemed to quite match up, and the secret organization he had founded went quiet after his death. The second in command of the WNP, Michel Libert, would later go on to be questioned for involvement in the Brabant Killers. I'll go into that in a while, but I hope this helps provide a little color on this background. Members of the Westland New Post would go on to inspire some controversy. In 1987, Marcel Barbier was convicted in a violent double murder, which took place at an Anderlecht synagogue in 1983. When police had searched his home, they found not only highly classified documents belonging to NATO, but also neo-Nazi memorabilia and multiple firearms. As of today, he has not been theorized to have been involved in the Brabant Killers, but this information showcases at least one thing: that members of the WNP had ties to high-ranking government officials, since the documents in Marcel Barbier's possession had come from Michel Libert, the second in command of the Westland New Post. At the time, Libert was just a volunteer working at a NATO transmission center. Through some pretty lax security, he would obtain documents and disperse them to various members of the WNP for publication. Michel Libert would face questioning throughout the years, including being detained as a potential member of the Brabant Killers as recently as 2014. However, he has never been charged with any crimes tying him to the band of killers. In addition to the Westland New Post, another far-right organization that had gained prominence in the early 1980s was the group known as Vlaams Blok. Unlike the Westland New Post, Vlaams Blok operated itself as a legitimate political party. Their goal wasn't to operate in the dark, but rather enact change through legislation. Their goals were focused on declaring Flemish Independence. In the mid-1980s, the Vlaams Blok began to shift their focus from Flemish independence to what they considered, quote-unquote, the immigrant problem. Their end goal was to preserve Flemish culture and the Dutch language, and it's possible that they saw the oncoming wave of new, non-European immigrants as an insult to their own culture. After some dismal showings in the early 1980s elections, the Vlaams Blok began to offer more discriminatory views in their positions. This made the group much more popular, but it also led to a 1989 agreement that barred members of the Vlaams Blok from entering government positions. A court would later rule in 2004 that the group had used racial discrimination as a party platform, and this led to a complete overhaul of the party. The Vlaams Blok became the Vlaams Blok and is the most popular Flemish faction in Belgian politics right now. Normally, I would not talk about political parties in stories such as this, but the Vlaams Blok would become known for stoking racial tension to win elections, and many consider the Brabant Killers to be a reactionary force built around vilifying French immigrants. After all, many of the surviving Brabant witnesses recalled them as sounding like dignified Frenchmen. However, that's essentially where this theory ends. Many that believe the Vlaams Blok were involved in supporting or harboring the Brabant Killers center on them using racial discord to benefit as a political entity, to try and enact racist legislation. This would, in effect, make the Brabant Killers a false flag group meant to inspire hate against French immigrants and close down the borders, but there's not much evidence to support it. I don't find this theory as credible or as intricate as the ties to the Westland New Post, but I hope that it at least sheds some light on the Belgian world at this time. There was, at the very least, a lot of societal blowback on immigrants, and it was being focused on particular groups, such as the French. I would be remiss if I also did not mention at least one other terrorist group active in the Brussels area at this time, known collectively as the CCC, which stood for Communist Combatant Cells. From 1984 to 1985, the group bombed and attacked at least 20 different targets, including NATO pipelines, large company buildings, and various institutes. Several people were injured and 2 people died during these various bombings, at least until the leader of the CCC, Pierre Carette, was arrested in December of 1985. He was given a life sentence just a month later, in January of 1986, and that would just so happen to coincide with the disappearance of the Brabant Killers. Many people think it stands as no coincidence that the bombings from the CCC began during the Brabant Killers' 1984 absence. That perhaps, in lieu of attacking grocery stores, Pierre Carette and his associates began bombing corporate buildings and government pipelines. The motive would have to be that Pierre was interested in disrupting the government at any cost. That perhaps attacking grocery stores would send the most blanket anti-commerce message possible. However, this also ignores the fact that the CCC would give notices to their targets ahead of the bombings, in the interest of not killing anyone. In fact, the only instance where anyone died from the CCC bombings, the Federation of Belgian Enterprises bombing in May of 1985, came after one of these such warnings. 2 firefighters had unfortunately disregarded the threat, attempting to clear the buildings of others, which resulted in their deaths. Many criticized the theory tying Pierre Carette to the Brabant Killers for ignoring these details. Despite the fact that Pierre looks a good amount like the sketches provided of the unknown criminal called the Killer, he was not interested in taking human lives. He was as anti-authority as one could get, but his bombings could have been focused on other targets besides empty buildings if he was interested in pursuing human tragedy like the Killer was. Still, many focus on the timing of the CCC disbandment as pretty uncanny. The Brabant Killers last struck in November of 1985, and the CCC just a month later, ending both chapters for Belgian culture. No ties or involvement have ever been confirmed between the two, just theories that have been given decades to marinate by a public unsatisfied with law enforcement. Departmental divisions and rivalries hampered the early investigation, causing enormous amounts of miscommunication. At any given point, you could have a dozen or so police departments handling different investigations. As I've discussed before, law enforcement was pretty splintered at this time, so this was the end result. Multiple investigations with various theories, and each department looking at different suspects to hopefully crack the case on their own. And if that wasn't enough, you also had the predicament of many law enforcement agencies serving at the behest of their local magistrate or judge. This resulted in many cases that were aimed primarily at proving the case of the prosecutor, which many people think hampered this particular investigation. The people of Belgium had already been asking for a reform when it came to law enforcement, but this case would be one of the major inspirations to do so. Throughout the rest of the 1980s and 1990s, this debate would continue, until major reform happened in 2001. The last straw was the Marc Dutroux scandal, where a man with connections to local politicians and government officials managed to avoid jail time for the rapes and murders of little girls. But many people consider the Brabant Killers the ticking time bomb that continued to erode public distrust in law enforcement and their investigative tactics. Throughout the investigation into the Gang of Nivelles, police were hounded by claims of incompetence or gross negligence. Evidence was reportedly mishandled, or would just flat out go missing. There were reports of bullet casings from a crime scene being kicked around by first responders, and police at the scene were uninterested in stopping them. Fingerprint records from a burned-out vehicle driven by the Brabant Killers went missing from police custody, lending further credence to the theories about the criminals being or having ties to law enforcement. One vehicle that the killers drove was sent for destruction in a wrecking yard before forensics teams could look it over, destroying any evidence that could have been recovered. And in one case, a cigarette butt found at a crime scene was never tested for DNA. It was never confirmed to belong to one of the gunmen, but a savvy police officer had bagged the cigarette before anyone else could touch it. This officer was shocked when this piece of evidence was never even considered by the lead investigators, despite the case promptly hitting a dead end. The prosecutor in charge of the case, Jean de Pitre, was based out of Nivelles. If you recall, this is the municipality where the three criminals began their crime spree, so he was considered the lead investigator early on. De Pitre was convinced that the motive of the bandits was entirely monetary, that their goals may have inspired fear, but they were entirely motivated by greed. He also surmised that they were alcoholics, because of their constant theft of liquids like champagne, wine, coffee, and tea. Of course, this did not go over well with many other investigators and prosecutors who believed the gang to be terrorist. They wanted to focus on a more extremist angle, that the gunmen were inspired by political goals. The theft of grocery items and money was just a distraction from the chaos they were hoping to create. As 1985 came to a close, police were hell-bent on trying to link the Brabant Killers to any possible crimes or organizations, to simply whittle down all of the confusion. Of course, one of their most prominent leads died in the early days of 1986 in a hail of bullets. For most of 1985, police had been looking into Juan Mendez as a possible lead for the Brabant Killers. They didn't believe him to be responsible per se, but potentially someone he knew or was associated with. In 1985, Mendez had been at work, and his wife was at the grocery store, when someone broke into his home and stole several of his personal firearms. Mendez, who worked as a sales manager for a large gun manufacturer, was a bit of an enthusiast and had a sizable collection, all of which was stolen by someone close to him, both he and the investigators theorized. Later in the year, the Brabant Killers began to strike again. Mendez was out of the country for their first attacks, but later theorized that at least one of his weapons had been used in these attacks. Police and investigators kept insisting that none of his guns had been used in the commission of the various Brabant robberies, but Mendez was thinking otherwise. Mendez had long suspected an acquaintance of his for being responsible for the weapon theft, a man that went by the name of Madani Bohus. Mendez suspected Bohus, a former police officer that had become a private investigator a few years beforehand. Bohus was long suspected of being involved with shady practices that straddled the line of legality. In January of 1986, almost 2 months after the final assault by the Brabant Killers, Mendez had begun to move on from the theft of his weapons. He had kept ties with Madani Bohus because they were acquaintances, and rumors have long lingered that on the morning of January 7, 1986, Juan Mendez was on his way to meet up with Madani Bohus. That afternoon, a worried driver called the emergency hotline, telling them that a man had been found dead inside a vehicle. This driver had noticed the vehicle earlier that morning, and on their way home that afternoon, decided to check in on the suspicious vehicle, which had been parked along the shoulder of the E40 Brussels-Namur motorway. Juan Mendez was found dead in the driver's seat of his Volkswagen Passat, having been shot 6 times at close range. 4 of the bullets, which were hollow point, were aimed at his head, and he was additionally shot twice in the chest. Police theorized that he had been dead for at least 8 hours, putting his time of death in the 8 a.m. area. The brother of Juan Mendez, Jose, would be interviewed over the years about his brother's murder. He described in detail the relationship between his brother and associates of his, such as Madani Bohus. He also denied any allegations that his brother, whom he referred to as Tony, was involved in any right-wing extremist plots. Jose claims that his brother was just a geek that was fascinated by firearms and car engines. He was a true engineer at heart, who was survived by his wife. The investigation into Mendez's murder would quickly focus in on Madani Bohus, shining a light on his actions over the prior few years. Madani Bohus was the son of Armenian immigrants, who grew up in the Brussels area. Nicknamed Donnie by those that knew him, he grew up primarily speaking French. In 1974, Donnie was admitted to sub-officer school for the Belgian National Guard. Here, he became acquainted with another young man named Robert Bayer, and the two would literally become partners in crime over the next 15 years. In 1977, both Bohus and Bayer joined the Brussels Special Counseling Brigade, in a specialized detective unit focused on drug activities. Here, over the next few years, the two men would become immersed in the world of law enforcement, establishing a small network of informants that would prove fruitful over the coming years. While in this unit, both Bohus and Bayer became known for their ruthless tactics. They were known to break the rules of their own unit to accomplish their goals. In the early 1980s, the two men were let go from the Drug Enforcement Unit and transferred to smaller police departments where they could not get into as much trouble. They kept their ears to the ground though, and they were rumored to be involved with various thefts and attacks in 1981 and 1982. Many think that they were committing crimes while employed with police departments to benefit from inside information, and to potentially steer the investigations away from themselves. In 1983, both men, Donnie Bohus and Robert Bayer, had had enough of their small-time police work and left their departments. They joined up once again and formed a private investigator firm named ARI in April of 1983. Here, they basically continued to operate outside of the law, using illegal activities such as breaking and entering and wiretapping to get hard-to-reach information. While the network of informants they had established proved successful, the business side of having a PI firm did not work for Donnie Bohus. Robert Bayer, his partner, described Donnie as being an aggressive man, someone who would yell at potential customers, thus making them walk right out the door. Bayer also claims that the two of them were never friends, that it was impossible for anyone to love Madani Bohus because of his gruff, oftentimes violent demeanor. The private eye agency, ARI, closed up shop in October of 1984, but that did not stop the two men from being involved in each other's lives. The two men continued to work together throughout the mid-1980s, engaging in the black market at the same time as the Brabant Killers strikes. Another man tied to the black market went by the name of Patrick Hamers, but he's someone I'll discuss in a little bit. The two men have long rumored to have been a part of the Brabant gang, with many theorizing that Robert Bayer, known for his tall and lanky frame, was the giant. Of course, this would make Madani Bohus, whose dark features were noted, the violent and unhinged killer. When the weapons belonging to Juan Mendez were stolen in 1985, suspicion fell on Bohus for his involvement in the robbery. At the time, he was knee-deep in the world of firearms, buying and selling the weapons to unsavory individuals. When Mendez was murdered, Donnie Bohus was arrested and charged for the murder. For the next 2 years, he would spend time in prison awaiting trial. However, the case fell through and he was released in 1988. With his partner behind bars, Robert Bayer had continued working as a private investigator. However, he fell into legal trouble in the fall of 1987 for illegal wiretapping. Just like Donnie, these charges were dropped shortly thereafter, and Bayer also became a free man, fleeing to Spain to avoid further investigations by police. Many theorized that the reason the Brabant Killers might have stopped their crime spree was because Madani Bohus had gone to prison for the murder of Juan Mendez. He spent 2 years behind bars, at which point the other members of the gang might have just moved on. Despite their regained freedom, the two men were not able to avoid legal trouble for very long. They both became wanted after an encounter with a Lebanese diamond dealer in Antwerp in September of 1989. They have never talked about the details of this encounter, such as why they were meeting, what happened, etc. But the meeting ended with Bayer getting injured and Madani Bohus shooting and killing the diamond dealer. The other people present for the crime, including two of the victim's associates and his teenage son, were able to identify the two suspects. Madani Bohus was immediately arrested, and Robert Bayer spent the next 2 years fleeing government officials in various countries. He was spotted in Spain, Portugal, Brazil, Vietnam, and later Thailand, where he was then arrested for using a fake passport in 1991, and then extradited to Belgian authorities. The two men awaited trial for the murder of the diamond dealer, which began in 1995. It was one of the longest and most publicized trials in Belgium at the time, lasting over 5 months. In the end, the two men were not only convicted of the 1989 murder, but an unrelated 1982 murder of a security guard in the process of an armed robbery. Madani Bohus was given a 20-year sentence, and Robert Bayer was given a 14-year sentence. For the time, the two men were off of the streets. But the link to the 1982 robbery, which culminated in the shooting of a security guard, opened up a new can of worms for investigators. This showcased that the crimes the two men had been committing were not only going back to the dawn of the Brabant Killers, who started their crime spree in the same year, 1982, but also while they were active police officers. The two men did not start their independent PI agency until 1983, and, to make matters even worse, the armed robbery had been very similar to those conducted by the Brabant Killers. Despite extensive prison sentences, both Robert Bayer and Madani Bohus found themselves free men within 5 years of their incarceration. Bayer was released in December of 1999, and shortly thereafter moved to Thailand. He has been there ever since, even publishing an autobiography in February of 2010. In this book, he claims that he worked on behalf of intelligence wings of the Soviet Union, working to destabilize Belgium. Journalists seriously doubt his claims, but he has stuck by them in the years since. In the book, he also freely admits to crimes committed by himself and his partner, Madani Bohus, such as certain robberies and murders. But he has not admitted guilt for playing part in the Brabant Killers, so there is still no proof that he was a part of that operation. Madani Bohus, on the other hand, has not had the same kind of luck. Donnie was freed on parole on September 15, 2000, at which point he moved to a small city in France. At this point, he had been long divorced from his wife, and he had an estranged relationship with his children, so he lived out in the middle of the woods on his own. In November of 2005, his body was discovered in the yard of his own home. Not to focus on the gory details, his body was found decapitated in what police describe as a yard work accident. He had apparently been working with a chainsaw in his yard, attempting to cut down a tree, when something happened and he accidentally killed himself. French authorities, apparently unaware of his criminal history, decided to okay the coroner's request to have his body cremated. As such, the body of Madani Bohus was disposed of before any real DNA testing could have been done. Testing that was unavailable to early investigators was now made impossible by the cremation of a major suspect's body. But they did find some interesting pieces of information in the home of Madani Bohus. In his home, police found a shotgun, similar to the one used by one of the Brabant Killers. They also found information about various subjects. Some of this information, found hidden on Donnie's computer, included info about the murder of Juan Mendez and correspondence with figures in the far right-wing extremist community. Some of this has allegedly been tied to Michel Libert, the former second-in-command of the Westland New Post, who I mentioned earlier in this episode. This just fed more fuel to the fire of the Brabant Killers being a cover for right-wing terrorists, but over a decade after this revelation, no more information has been released. In 2006, police would clear the shotgun of being involved in any of the Brabant Killer strikes, but many still consider it beyond a coincidence that Madani Bohus would have the exact same model as one used by the killer himself. Before I wrap up my discussion about Madani Bohus and Robert Bayer, I do want to bring up something I could not organically bring up throughout their investigations. While Bohus was behind bars in the mid-1980s, after being accused of the murder of Juan Mendez, police discovered a garage locker rented out to him. In the locker, they would find weapons belonging to not only Madani Bohus and Robert Beyer, but also weapons stolen from Mendez in 1985, and weapons stolen from an anti-terror unit in 1981. This anti-terror unit, nicknamed the Dayan Brigade, was named after Diana, the Greek goddess of the hunt. It was a unit created in the aftermath of the 1972 Olympics in Munich. If you're not familiar, during these Olympics, a terrorist organization named Black September took roughly a dozen hostages, primarily Israeli athletes, but also a German policeman. All of the hostages were killed, resulting in a colossal international incident. So, this Dayan Brigade was created as a wing of the gendarmerie in an effort to combat terrorism directly. Throughout the years, the Dayan Brigade would continuously find its way into conversations about the Brabant Killers, including some of the most recent developments, which I'll get to in this episode or the next. But for the time, just remember the history of the Dayan Brigade. In 1982, right around the time that the Brabant Killer attacks began, a building dedicated to the Dayan Brigade was broken into. This building was the arms depot of this special anti-terror unit, an armory, if you will. Weapons were stolen, and police were stumped as to how someone had managed to break into the weapons locker of one of the nation's most highly skilled law enforcement units, let alone the who or the why. For years, that crime had gone unsolved. Media often tied the break-in of the Dayan Brigade to the Brabant Killers, not just because of the coincidence of their timing and location, but because information about the Dayan Brigade was kept mostly under wraps. This wasn't a unit well known among circles outside of law enforcement. Again, here was a tie between the theft of weapons and law enforcement. Well, in the weapons locker that Madani Bohus had left behind, discovered in 1987 by police, there were apparently weapons belonging to this Dayan Brigade. Stolen 5 years prior, investigators had reached no constructive leads as to whom had stolen the guns, but this provided the first concrete clue. Police were pretty quick to distance themselves from this story, never officially confirming that weapons from the Dayan Brigade were found in this garage locker. However, it has been theorized that law enforcement did not want to expose alleged links between their own agents and the Brabant Killers, so they let this story slide to the side. Even if Madani Bohus wasn't a part of this robbery or the Brabant Killers, it stands to reason that he might have obtained the weapons through his dealings on the black market. After all, he was immersed in the world of gun running for certain organizations, having ties to right-wing extremist organizations that would be after untraceable firearms. When Madani Bohus died in 2005, the possibility of discovering this information seemed to die with him. But on his computer, police found records pointing to other such locations as this garage locker, places where weapons and ammunition were hidden, perhaps awaiting pickup by a potential buyer. The location of these spots was hidden, purposefully deleted by Bohus sometime before his death. Police have yet to identify any of these spots, leading to the theory that there are some weapon caches in the greater Brussels area, hidden in plain sight. Neither Madani Bohus or Robert Beyer have been proven to have any connection to the Brabant Killers, but in my opinion, they're two of the most likely candidates. Their connections to the underground firearm market, their past in law enforcement, their physical attributes, their proclivity for violence. It all points to a history that has gone unexposed. What you have heard so far is only one half of my content accumulated about the investigation into the Brabant Killers and the various suspects and theories that have cropped up ever since. In between the time I originally recorded this episode and now, new information has come to light, which basically means I need to rework the entire ending. So, because of this news, I have continued to add to the final part of the story, which will be out next weekend. I did not intend to bait and switch everyone, especially those who thought this was going to be the final part of the story, so I am sorry for that. But this story will conclude next weekend with the release of Part 5 of the Brabant Killers.